The scratching sound against my bedroom window started 3 nights ago. At first, I dismissed it as tree branches in the wind, but there are no trees near my 3rd-floor apartment. Something wants and dubbed my name is Alex Chen, and until last week, I was just another overworked graduate student renting a small apartment in Oakwood. It's a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city that most people have never heard of. The rent was cheap, the neighbors kept to themselves, and the location was convenient enough for my daily commute to the university. The building itself is nothing special, a converted textile factory from the 1920s, with exposed brick walls, creaky wooden floors, and pipes that groan and knock throughout the night. But it was home, and I never felt uncomfortable here until the incidents began. It started with small things that I initially brushed off as forgetfulness or coincidence. Items in my apartment would be slightly out of place, my coffee mug on the wrong shelf, books rearranged on my desk, or the bathroom door left ajar when I was certain I had closed it. I blamed it on stress and lack of sleep due to my thesis deadline approaching. Then came the peculiar smells, brief whiffs of something sweet and sickly, like overripe fruit or floral perfume that would disappear as quickly as they came. I checked for mold, took out the trash more frequently, and even asked my landlord if there might be an issue with the ventilation system. He found nothing wrong. The 3rd night is when I first heard the scratching. It was just past midnight, and I had finally drifted off to sleep when the sound jolted me awake. A deliberate, methodical scraping against my bedroom window. 3 slow scratches, a pause, then 3 more. I froze under my covers, heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the window. The blinds were drawn, but through the thin gaps between the slats, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of long, thin fingers pressing against the glass. I told myself it was impossible. My bedroom window faces nothing but a sheer drop to the parking lot below. There's no ledge, no fire escape, nothing that could support a person or even a large animal. When I finally gathered the courage to look, there was nothing there. Last night, I heard whispers coming from inside my closet, faint, hurried conversations in a language I couldn't understand, stopping abruptly whenever I moved. I haven't opened that closet door since. The worst part? This morning I found a small handprint on the bathroom mirror, much too small to belong to an adult, visible only when the steam from my shower fogged up the glass. I live alone, and no children have ever set foot in this apartment. As I reached out to touch it, the handprint seemed to press back against mine from the other side of the mirror, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what's happening to me, I need to tell you about the local legends of Oakwood Heights and the 3 specific urban myths that everyone in this neighborhood knows but never discusses openly. I didn't pay much attention to them when I first moved here, dismissing them as local folklore meant to spook newcomers. Now, I'm not so sure. The first legend concerns the factory that my apartment building used to be. According to old newspaper clippings I found in the university archives, there was a devastating fire here in 1923. It started in the middle of the night while several child workers, illegally employed and hidden from inspectors, were locked inside to complete an urgent order. The official death toll was recorded as 0, but locals have always maintained that the screams of children could be heard for weeks afterward, and that the company owner quickly demolished and renovated the damaged sections to hide any evidence. They say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the children playing in the empty hallways or glimpse them peering from windows on the upper floors. Some residents claim to have found small toys or handprints in their apartments, appearing and disappearing mysteriously. The second legend is about a woman known as the Widow in White. Supposedly, in the 1950s, a woman lived in apartment 3, my apartment, who lost her husband in a tragic accident. Consumed by grief, she would stand by the window every night, watching and waiting for him to return home. After several months, neighbors reported that they stopped seeing her, but would occasionally glimpse a woman in a white nightgown standing at the window, only to vanish when they looked again. When the landlord finally checked the apartment, they found it empty with no trace of the woman. According to the story, anyone who lives in 3B will eventually see the widow in white in their peripheral vision, usually near the windows or reflected. In mirrors, her face always just slightly obscured. The third legend is perhaps the most disturbing and the one I initially found least credible. People call it the knocking game. Supposedly, at exactly 3:33 a.m., if you hear 3 knocks on your door or window, you must never, under any circumstances, answer or acknowledge them. The knocks are said to come from something that cannot enter your home without invitation. If you respond or open the door, you're allowing it in. Those who have answered reportedly experience escalating phenomena: whispers in empty rooms, objects moving on their own, scratching from inside the walls before disappearing altogether. Their apartments are later found empty with no signs of forced entry or struggle, just a lingering sweet smell and sometimes a small object left behind that didn't belong to them. I didn't believe any of these stories until 3 nights ago, when I woke up at precisely 3:33 a.m. to 3 distinct knocks on my bedroom window, the same window where I now hear the scratching. Half asleep and disoriented, I called out, "Who's there?" before fully remembering that no one could possibly be outside my window. That's when the scratching began. Now, as I sit at my desk writing this, I can feel something has changed in my apartment. The air feels heavier, charged with a presence I can't see, but can certainly feel. From the corner of my eye, I keep glimpsing movement, a shadow passing behind me, reflected in my computer screen. A figure in white standing by the window that disappears when I turn to look. My closet door, which I've taped shut, occasionally rattles as if something inside is testing its boundaries. It's getting dark now, and I don't want to be here when night falls. But something tells me that wherever I go, it will follow. The scratching has started again, earlier than usual. 3 slow scrapes against the glass, a pause, then 3 more. But this time, it's coming from all the windows simultaneously. And now, I can hear something else, a faint knocking from inside my taped closet door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. And whispers, getting louder, calling my name. Wait, did I just hear someone call my name from the hallway outside my apartment? It sounded like my neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy. Maybe she can help. I should go check. I'll be right back. The days that followed that first night of scratching became increasingly unbearable. After hearing what sounded like my neighbor's voice, I opened my apartment door to find the hallway empty and eerily silent. No sign of Mrs. Abernathy or anyone else. When I knocked on her door to check if she had called me, she answered, looking confused and concerned. "Honey, I've been watching my shows all evening. I haven't left my apartment or called for anyone." Her eyes narrowed as she studied my face. "Are you feeling all right? You look like you haven't slept in days." Before closing her door, she hesitated and added in a hushed tone, "Be careful about answering calls in this building, especially at night. Not everything that calls your name is someone you want to meet." Back in my apartment, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps I was experiencing auditory hallucinations from sleep deprivation. Or maybe the stress of my upcoming thesis defense was manifesting in peculiar ways. I decided to conduct some research, thinking a scientific approach might help dispel my growing fears. I started by setting up my phone to record audio while I slept, and I placed small pieces of tape on certain doors and objects to see if they would be disturbed overnight. The results only deepened my dread. The morning after setting up my experiment, I found 3 of the tape seals broken, the one on my closet door, the bathroom cabinet, and oddly, the refrigerator. The audio recording was mostly silent except for occasional static, and at exactly 3:33 a.m. What sounded like children's laughter followed by a woman's soft sobbing. The most disturbing part came near the end of the recording, a voice, barely above a whisper, speaking directly into the microphone. "We see you watching us now. It's your turn to play." I needed to know more about the building's history, so I spent the day at the local library and historical society. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. The newspaper articles about the factory fire were more detailed than I initially realized. Among the names of the children presumed to have died was a girl named Elizabeth Abernathy, possibly related to my elderly neighbor. Further research revealed that the widow who had lived in my apartment was Margaret Wilson, who didn't just lose her husband in an accident. He had disappeared without a trace after neighbors reported hearing a violent argument from their apartment. Most unsettling was learning about a series of disappearances in the building during the 1970s, all following a similar pattern. Residents reporting strange phenomena before vanishing, leaving behind fully furnished apartments with no signs of packing or planning to leave. That night, I decided to stay at a motel, packing a small overnight bag and leaving my apartment just before sunset. The relief I felt upon checking into the modest roadside establishment was immense clean sheets, generic artwork on the walls, and most importantly, no history of hauntings or disappearances. I took a long shower, ordered takeout, and for the first time in days, felt my muscles begin to relax, but the feeling didn't last. Around midnight, as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone chimed with a notification. It was from my home security app. Motion detected in my apartment. With trembling fingers, I opened the app and accessed the camera feed from the small security camera I had installed facing my living room. The footage showed my apartment, dimly lit by the streetlights outside the window. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just my familiar furniture sitting in shadow. Then, something moved. A small figure, about the size of a child, darted across the frame too quickly to make out clearly. Moments later, a taller shape appeared, a woman in what looked like a white nightgown, standing perfectly still in the center of my living room, her face obscured by long dark hair. As I watched in horror, she slowly raised her head toward the camera, and though I couldn't see her eyes, I knew she was looking directly at me. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. My phone suddenly felt ice cold in my hands. The screen flickered, and the image changed. The woman was gone, but now the camera showed my motel room door from the inside, as if the camera was no longer in my apartment, but somehow in the motel room with me, facing the door. 3 distinct knocks sounded from the app, from my phone, and simultaneously from my actual motel room door. It was 3:33 a.m. "Who's there?" I called out, instantly regretting breaking the cardinal rule of the knocking game. "Housekeeping," a voice answered, a child's voice trying to sound like an adult. I didn't respond, frozen in fear on the bed. The knocking came again, more insistent. "You left something important at home," the voice said, no longer attempting to sound adult-like. "We brought it for you." Through the peephole, I saw nothing. But when I reluctantly checked the security app again, the camera, which should have been showing my empty apartment, displayed a clear image of a small girl in old-fashioned clothing standing outside my motel room door, holding what looked like a stuffed rabbit, a toy I had never seen before. As I watched, she held it up to the peephole from her side, smiling with too many teeth. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in the bathtub, lights on, clutching a hotel Bible and waiting for dawn. When morning finally came, I opened the door to find the hallway empty. No child, no toy. But taped to my door was a crayon drawing of 3 figures holding hands, a child, a woman in a dress, and a tall, thin entity with unnaturally long arms. Written across the bottom in childish scrawl, "Come home soon. We miss you." I checked out immediately, but I knew I couldn't keep running. Whatever had attached itself to me wasn't confined to my apartment. It had followed me, and perhaps more. Terrifyingly, it had been waiting for me here. I needed to confront this situation head-on, to understand what these entities wanted and why they had chosen me. With grim determination, I drove back to my apartment building, stopping only to purchase sage, salt, and religious symbols from various traditions. Desperate measures from someone who had never been particularly superstitious until now. When I arrived home, my apartment looked exactly as I had left it, with one exception. On every smooth surface, mirrors, windows, the television screen, even the glossy cover of a magazine on my coffee table were small handprints, as if a child had pressed their hands against them from the other side. I remember my grandfather once telling me that to defeat a monster, you must first understand it. To understand it, you must get close to it. But as I stand here in my apartment, surrounded by evidence of entities I cannot see, but who clearly see me, I'm beginning to think that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Still, I have nowhere else to go, and running hasn't worked. Tonight, at 3:33 a.m., when the knocking inevitably comes, I'm going to answer. The hours leading up to 3:33 a.m. were the longest of my life. I had prepared my apartment as best I could, drawing from various cultural traditions and paranormal defense mechanisms I'd researched. Salt lines across all thresholds, sage bundles ready to be lit, protective symbols drawn on paper and taped to mirrors and windows. I'd even set up additional cameras, hoping to capture more evidence of what I was dealing with. I didn't really believe these measures would work, but they gave me a sense of control in a situation where I had none. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the apartment began to change. The air grew heavy and seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The ever-present scratching at my window intensified, no longer just 3 scrapes at a time, but continuous, desperate movements, like something trying to claw its way in. The whispers from the closet became more distinct. I could make out phrases now, mostly children's rhymes and counting games, occasionally interrupted by a woman's voice saying what sounded like, "He's coming." I tried to distract myself by reviewing what I'd learned about the building's history and the 3 urban legends. During my research at the Historical Society, I discovered a disturbing connection between them. The factory owner who had allegedly covered up the deaths of child workers was Jonathan Wilson, the husband of Margaret Wilson, the widow in white. According to local records, after his disappearance, investigators had briefly considered Margaret a suspect but could never find evidence of foul play. The third connection was more tenuous but equally unsettling. The series of disappearances in the 1970s had begun shortly after a new tenant moved into the building, a man named Robert Thomas, who claimed to be a folklorist studying urban legends, but who neighbors described as odd and too interested in the building's history. At around 2 a.m., my electricity flickered and died, plunging the apartment into darkness, save for my battery-powered lantern. My phone also died despite being fully charged moments before. The temperature dropped dramatically, I could see, my breath clouding in front of me. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that somehow felt louder than any noise. Then, at precisely 3:33 a.m., according to my watch, the only timepiece still functioning, it happened. 3 distinct knocks on my front door. I had prepared myself for this moment, had steeled my resolve to face whatever waited on the other side. But now that it had arrived, terror threatened to overwhelm me. The knocks came again, more insistent this time. With shaking hands, I approached the door, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I pressed my ear against the wood, but heard nothing from the hallway outside. Taking a deep breath, I called out, "Who's there?" No response came. Just 3 more knocks, slower and more deliberate. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. This time, An answer came, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. Some childlike, some adult, all slightly distorted as if speaking through water. We want you to remember. Remember what? I had no connection to this building's history, had lived here barely a year. Before I could ask, the door shuddered violently, as if struck by great force. The protective salt line at the threshold scattered. I stumbled backward. As the pounding continued, the solid wood door flexing inward as if something impossibly strong was trying to break through. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault on my door stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a small voice directly behind me whisper, "Too late. We're already inside." I whirled around to find myself face to face with a small girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing what looked like factory worker clothes from the 1920s. Her form was semi-transparent, and her eyes held a wisdom and sorrow no child should possess. Behind her stood the widow in white, her face finally visible, beautiful but gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold me in place. And towering over both of them was a third figure, tall and thin with unnaturally long limbs and a face hidden in shadow, the entity I had glimpsed in my peripheral vision these past few days. "You're the one who answered the door," the child said, her voice echoing slightly. "The others ran or hid, but you faced us. Now you must help us." "Help you how?" I managed to ask, fighting the urge to flee. The widow stepped forward, a movement fluid yet somehow wrong, as if she was moving through different physics than our world operated on. "He trapped us here," she said, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "My husband. He didn't just hide the children's deaths. He used them. Used their fear and pain in a ritual to extend his life, to become something more than human." The tall entity shifted, and though I couldn't see its face clearly, I sensed it was watching me intently. The child continued the explanation. "The knocking is his game. He finds new vessels when his current body wears out. Those who answer are tested. If they run, he hunts them for sport. If they face him, they become candidates." With growing horror, I understood what they were implying. The disappearances in the 1970s, that was him? Taking a new body? The widow nodded. Robert Thomas wasn't a folklorist. He was Jonathan wearing a new face, returning to feed on the energies he had bound to this place. And now, 50 years later, he needs to change again. "Why are you telling me this? Why show yourselves to me?" The child took my hand, her touch cold, but not unpleasant. "Because you can end it. We've waited decades for someone who could see all three of us, who wouldn't dismiss us as stress or imagination. Someone who would research rather than run. Someone with the right blood." "Right blood?" I repeated, confused. The widow gestured to a framed photo on my desk, my graduation picture, standing proudly with my parents and grandparents. "Your grandmother's maiden name was Abernathy. Elizabeth was her aunt, lost in the fire. You have a connection to this place you never knew. That's why he's chosen you, and that's why we can reach you." I felt dizzy as pieces fell into place, my inexplicable draw to this specific apartment building when apartment hunting. My grandmother's odd reaction when I told her where I'd be living. Her insistence that I take her old silver locket for protection. What do I need to do? The tall entity finally spoke, its voice like stones grinding together. "Let me in completely. Give me access to your mind, your memories, your body. I can use your connection to end him permanently." The child quickly interjected. "Don't listen. That's him, Jonathan Wilson. He's been masquerading as the third entity, trying to trick you. The real third manifestation hasn't shown itself yet." Confusion and fear paralyzed me as I looked between the three figures. Who was telling the truth? Was I being manipulated by the very entity I needed to defeat? Or was the child trying to prevent my only chance at ending this nightmare? As I hesitated, The tall figure began to change, stretching and distorting until it no longer resembled anything human. Its shadowed face split into a grin that extended far beyond the confines of a normal mouth, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "Clever little ghost," it hissed at the child. But it doesn't matter now. The invitation was already given when they answered the first knock. I've been entering slowly, piece by piece, every time they acknowledged our presence. With mounting horror, I realized the entity was right. Every time I had responded to the phenomena, checking the window after hearing scratches, calling out to false voices, answering the door just now, I had been inviting this thing further into my life, my home, myself. I could feel it now, like tendrils of ice spreading through my thoughts. Foreign memories and impulses that weren't my own beginning to surface. The widow and the child stood their ground, placing themselves between me and the encroaching entity. "We can help you fight him," the widow said urgently. "But you must complete the connection to us as well. The locket your grandmother gave you, open it now." With trembling fingers, I fumbled for the silver locket I had dutifully worn, but never opened since my grandmother had pressed it into my hands. As the clasp finally gave way, a small curl of dark hair fell into my palm, along with a tiny, age-yellowed photograph of a young girl with solemn eyes, Elizabeth Abernathy. The moment the locket opened, the apartment erupted into chaos. The tall entity shrieked, a sound so primordial and full of rage that it seemed to vibrate the very atoms of the air. The walls began to bleed a dark, viscous fluid as the floorboards buckled and warped. Through the windows, I could see that the entire building was changing, the brick exterior rippling as if alive. The child, Elizabeth, took my hand again, her form now more solid than before. "It's starting," she whispered, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "He's losing control of the building, but he'll fight to keep what he's built." Outside my apartment door, sounds of commotion erupted, doors slamming, voices calling out in confusion and fear. My neighbors were awakening to the nightmare that had lurked in our building all along. I heard Mrs. Abernathy's voice among them, stronger than I'd ever heard it, directing people toward the stairs. She had known all along, I realized. She had been watching, waiting for this moment just as the spirits had. The widow's form grew brighter, her spectral glow illuminating the darkened apartment. Jonathan bound us here to feed his transformation, but that binding works both ways. With the right blood connection, your connection, we can pull him back into the spirit realm where he no longer holds power. The entity that had been posing. As the third manifestation lashed out, its elongated limbs stretching to impossible lengths as it tried to grab me. I jumped back, colliding with my kitchen counter. My hand fell upon the iron skillet I had left there, one of the few cooking implements I actually used in my graduate student lifestyle, acting on instinct and half-remembered folklore about iron. Repelling supernatural entities, I swung the skillet through the creature's reaching arm. It connected with a shock that reverberated up my arm, and the entity recoiled, its form momentarily disrupting like static on an old television. "Iron disrupts his energy," Elizabeth explained quickly. "He's not fully corporeal yet, not until he completely takes over a new host." The revelation gave me a desperate idea. If the entity couldn't materialize fully without a host, and if my blood connection through Elizabeth could somehow reverse the binding ritual, perhaps there was a way to trap it between states. I lunged for my research notes scattered across the coffee table, scanning frantically for the details of the original factory fire. "The boiler room," I exclaimed, pieces clicking into place. The fire started in the boiler room. That must be where he performed the original ritual, where the children died. The widow nodded gravely. "The heart of his power. It's been sealed off since the renovation, hidden behind walls on the lowest level. A plan formed in my mind, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but the only option I could see. We need to go there, now." As if in response to my decision, the entity let out another unearthly shriek and began to change again, its form collapsing and reforming into something that approximated human shape. A tall man in early 20th century clothing, his face handsome, but hard, eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. Jonathan Wilson, I breathed, finally seeing the true face of the factory owner whose greed and occult ambitions had created this nightmare. He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Not just Wilson anymore. I've worn many names, many faces. Soon, I'll wear yours. His voice was cultured, pleasant even, making his words all the more chilling. Not if I can help it, I replied, gripping the iron skillet tighter. The apartment. Door burst open, revealing Mrs. Abernathy holding an ancient-looking key. Quickly, she urged, her eyes taking in the supernatural standoff with remarkable composure. The others are evacuating, but we need to end this now, before he regains full strength. As we rushed from the apartment, Jonathan Wilson's laugh followed, U.S. echoing impossibly through the building's corridors. Run all you want, his voice reverberated. This entire structure is part of me now. There's nowhere within these walls you can hide. The journey down to the building's lowest level was a descent into madness. The stairwell twisted and elongated, sometimes spanning what felt like hundreds of steps between floors, other times abruptly dropping us to landings that shouldn't exist. The walls pulsed like a living thing, and more than once. Hands reached out from the solid surfaces, grasping at our clothes and hair, the trapped souls of previous victims. I realized with horror that Mrs. Abernathy moved with surprising agility. For her age, leading us through the bizarre geography with the confidence of someone who had mapped this nightmare landscape long ago. My family has been watching this building for generations, she explained as we navigated a corridor that kept trying to circle back on itself, waiting for someone with the right connection to Elizabeth to arrive. When you moved in, I knew. It was finally time. Why didn't you warn me? I gasped, ducking under a doorway that was rapidly shrinking. Would you have believed me? Would you have stayed? She shot me a knowing look. You needed to experience it yourself, to believe fully. Half belief would have gotten you killed or worse, turned you into his next vessel. The spectral forms of Elizabeth and the widow in white flickered alongside us, sometimes fading almost completely when we passed through areas of the building where Wilson's influence was strongest. They seemed to be fighting their own battle just to remain manifested, to resist being pulled back under his control. Finally, we reached what appeared to be a dead-end brick wall in the basement level, where the corridor should have continued. Mrs. Abernathy pressed her hands against it. Feeling along the surface until she found what she was looking for, a brick that moved slightly under pressure. When she pushed it, a section of the wall swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The original entrance to the boiler room, she whispered. Sealed off after the fire and hidden from building plans. My grandmother showed me once when I was a child, made me memorize its location. Just in case, she said. The passage led to a large circular chamber dominated by the rusted skeleton of an industrial boiler. The metal behemoth had burst open during the fire, its inner components now exposed like the ribs of some mechanical leviathan. The floor around it was stained dark, and I tried not to think about what had caused those stains almost a century ago. Arranged around the boiler in a perfect circle were small objects, toys, shoes, hair ribbons, artifacts belonging to the children who had died here, preserved in some unnatural stasis. At the center of the circle, mounted on a stand of twisted metal, was a large leather-bound book. Its cover worked with strange symbols that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. His grimoire, the widow in white said, her form strengthening now that we were at the heart of the building's power. The source of the ritual that bound us here. Destroy it, and the binding begins to unravel. As I stepped toward the book, the air thickened and the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the rusted metal surfaces, and our breath clouded before us. The shadowy form of Jonathan Wilson materialized between me and the grimoire, more solid than before, his features contorted. With rage, "You think I'll let you undo a century of work?" he snarled, his voice echoing strangely in the circular chamber. "Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed to achieve this? What powers I've bargained with?" "You sacrificed others," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Children, innocent people, your own wife." At the mention of his wife, his expression flickered briefly to something almost human: regret? Guilt? But it was quickly subsumed by the cold mask of determination. Necessary steps on the path to transcendence. I've nearly achieved what alchemists and occultists have sought for millennia: true immortality, true power. At what cost? I challenged, inching closer to the grimoire while keeping the iron skillet between us. "You're not even human anymore. You're a parasite, jumping from host to host, feeding on fear and suffering." His form wavered, edges blurring as if he was struggling to maintain cohesion. "Humanity is overrated," he hissed, a brief flicker of consciousness in an indifferent universe. "I've become something eternal." From behind me, Mrs. Abernathy spoke, a voice carrying the weight of generations of family memory. "You've become a monster, Jonathan, and monsters can be slain." With those words, she threw something past me, a small object that arced through the air and landed directly on the open pages of the grimoire. It was a silver locket, identical to the one my grandmother had given me. As it touched the book, both began to glow with an unearthly light. Wilson screamed and lunged forward. The ghosts of Elizabeth and Margaret Wilson, his victims, his anchors to this world, intercepted him. Their spectral forms wrapped around his, holding him back as he thrashed and howled. "Now," Elizabeth's voice called out, strained with effort. "Complete the circle. Your blood to close what his blood opened." Understanding instinctively what needed to be done, I rushed to the grimoire. The locket had fallen open on the pages, revealing another lock of Elizabeth's hair and a family photograph, 4 generations of Abernathy women, including one who looked remarkably like my grandmother as a young woman. I removed my own locket and placed it alongside the first. Then, using the sharp edge of a broken piece of metal from the boiler, I cut my palm and pressed my bleeding hand to the pages of the book, directly over both lockets. "I break the binding," I recited, words coming to me as if I had always known them. "Blood of my blood, I release what was taken. I sever what was joined against nature's will. I return what was stolen." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The grimoire burst into unnatural flames, green and blue fire that consumed the pages but left my hand unburned. The circle of children's artifacts began to glow, each item lifting slightly from the ground. And throughout the building above us, a deep rumbling began, as if the very foundation was shaking itself apart. Jonathan Wilson's form was being pulled in multiple directions, stretching and tearing as the competing forces of his ritual and our counter-ritual fought for dominance. His face cycled rapidly through different visages, the faces of all his previous hosts. I realized, going back through decades of stolen lives. "You can't!" he shrieked, his voice no longer human, a chorus of agonized sounds. "You'll bring down the entire building. Everyone still inside will die." "The building is empty," Mrs. Abernathy said calmly. "I made sure of that. The only ones left are those of us who choose to be here to see this ended." As the grimoire continued to burn with otherworldly fire, spectral forms began to appear throughout the chamber. The ghosts of the factory children, dozens of them, emerging from hiding places where they had been trapped for nearly a century. They moved toward Wilson, their small hands reaching out to grasp his disintegrating form. "No," he howled as they pulled at him. "I am Jonathan Wilson. I am eternal." "I am." His words cut off as his form collapsed inward, pulled by countless hands into a singularity of light and sound that hovered for a moment in the center of the chamber. In that suspended moment, I saw Elizabeth smile a real smile, the innocent expression of a child freed from a terrible burden. She turned to me one last time. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's over now. We can go." The singularity expanded suddenly in a silent explosion of light that knocked me off my feet. When my vision cleared, the chamber was empty of spirits. The grimoire had crumbled to ash. The circle of artifacts had returned to the floor, and the oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the building was gone, replaced by the mundane mustiness of a long-sealed basement room. Mrs. Abernathy helped me to my feet, her eyes damp with unshed tears. "Elizabeth can rest now," she said softly. "All of them can." Above us, the building groaned and settled, adjusting to the sudden release of supernatural energy that had been sustaining its corrupted structure for decades. Dust and small debris rained from the ceiling. "We should leave," Mrs. Abernathy said urgently. "The building isn't going to collapse, but it will take time for it to stabilize." As we made our way back through the now normal passages of the basement, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "How did you know this would work? How did you know I was the right person?" She smiled sadly as we climbed the stairs. "The Abernathy women have been keeping watch for generations. My grandmother's sister Elizabeth died here, but before the fire, she had shown signs of sensitivity to the spiritual world. That sensitivity passed down through our bloodline. When you moved in with your grandmother's maiden name being Abernathy and started experiencing things almost immediately, I knew you had inherited the strongest connection yet." We emerged into the building's lobby to find it empty. The other residents gathered safely across the street. Through the glass doors, I could see flashing lights. Someone had called emergency services. "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly aware that my apartment was likely uninhabitable after what had transpired there. "Now, you live," Mrs. Abernathy said simply. "The burden my family has carried for generations is finally lifted. The spirits are at peace. Jonathan Wilson is gone. What you do with your freedom is up to you." Before I could respond, the front doors burst open as firefighters entered, concerned about reports of smoke and strange lights. In the commotion that followed, explanations, inspections, interviews with authorities, I lost track of Mrs. Abernathy. By the time I thought to look for her again, she had disappeared. The authorities found no evidence of fire or structural damage, attributing the reports to an electrical issue that had caused unusual light patterns and set off smoke detectors. The building was declared safe after inspection, though residents were advised to stay elsewhere for the night as a precaution. I never returned to apartment 3B. I arranged for friends to collect my belongings the next day and found a new place to live across town. My thesis was completed and defended 2 weeks later, the supernatural ordeal having strangely focused my academic mind. Rather than derailing it, Mrs. Abernathy's apartment was found empty when management checked it the following week. According to the superintendent, all her belongings were gone, as if she had moved out methodically over time, though no one had seen her carrying anything out. The only item left behind was an old photograph on the mantelpiece showing 4 generations of Abernathy women, with a space where one photo had clearly been removed. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning, I still wake to the sound of what might be scratching at my window, but it's only the branches of the maple tree outside my new apartment, swaying in the wind. My silver locket remains tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of a heritage I never knew I had and a connection to spirits I helped set free. As for the building on Oakwood Heights, it still stands, New tenants have moved in, unaware of its history or what transpired there. No more disappearances have been reported. No more whispers come from closets or scratching from windows. The urban legends have faded to just that, legends. Stories told to frighten newcomers, their kernel of truth now resolved. But sometimes, passing by my old building at dusk, I glimpse what might be a small figure waving from my former window, or the silhouette of an elderly woman watching from Mrs. Abernathy's apartment. Just tricks of the light, I tell myself. Just my imagination. Then again, perhaps not all spirits wish to move on. Perhaps some remain by choice, watching over the living, ensuring that what was ended stays ended. And perhaps some urban legends persist not to frighten, but to warn, to keep alive the memory of truths too strange for history books, truths that might otherwise be forgotten. After all, as I learned during those terrifying days, not all urban legends are false. Some are simply waiting for the right person to discover their truth.